Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Piers. This is Ukraine War News extra video, giving you the extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into, to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. Actually, we're just going to look at one big nugget today, and that is a Piers Morgan panel. My goodness, glutton for punishment I am. Piers Morgan has increasingly become a wingnut in my esteemed opinion. But actually, on Ukraine, he does kind of know the reality of the situation and who is to blame. But he allows people who have, I think, deeply problematic views to get a platform and spout their nonsense. We have a panel here of Scott Horton, who is a libertarian, sort of conservative libertarian, anti-war chap. So the American conservative describes his work as a masterful account of America's prolonged Afghan engagement. So he wrote a book on the Afghan war, and he's written a book called Provoked about the Ukraine war, which is you can imagine what that's like. Here is the Amazon reviews of it. Provoked: how Washington started the new Cold War with Russia and the catastrophe in Ukraine. So a 700-page book. Most people seem to like it. It hasn't got that many reviews, actually, to be perfectly fair. So if you like this kind of stuff, you're going to love it. The comparison is a 1-star review here that says, Russian propaganda. Book is based on, scare quotes, information from Russian bloggers and anti-Ukrainian bloggers. Could not read the entire book of fiction and nonsense. I doubt any Ukrainian citizen was interviewed or that they spent any time in Ukraine. Will make a good paperweight. So you've got him, right? He has his agenda. You've got Cenk Uygur from the Young Turks, who is actually, he's right on Putin, but he does adhere a little bit to the NATO expansionism argument, which is interesting because we get General Wesley Clark comes on later to put that to bed. And then we have Anastasiya Paraskevova, who I have interviewed several times before. She's a Russian-speaking Ukrainian from Kharkiv who has suffered under the bombardments there. And you've also got the former Navy SEAL who killed Osama bin Laden, Rob O'Neill. Now, he has become, it appears, I don't really know anything about him other than what I've heard in this. I have heard some of this already. And he's a kind of like, America's getting involved all around the world. I used to be sort of gung-ho, America first kind of, or, USA kind of guy. But now industrial, military industrial complex, etc., etc. And he would be aligned with Scott Horton. So I think it's not a great balance here. I think you've got Anastasia, who is clearly pro-Ukrainian. You've got Cenk Uygur, who is somewhat pro-Ukrainian, but saying really the war needs to stop. And you've got two people, particularly Scott Horton, who are basically spouting Russian propaganda. And we're going to have a look at some of this. Now, I am going to interrupt this. If you want to go and watch this without interruption, go and watch the original. Go to Piers Morgan Uncensored and eat your heart out. I'm going to interrupt this, and if you're going to whinge about me interrupting it, I'm not quite sure why you're here watching me watch this. So it's all about what my 2 cents worth, 2 pennies worth is concerning what is being said. I'm undoubtedly going to get angry because I've just watched some of this. And I got so angry that I thought, I want to share my anger. I want to share my anger with the team. Let's start off at broadly the beginning, where Piers Morgan lets Scott Horton have his opinion.
Zelensky seemed to be putting forward where Putin would keep the land that he's taken, but that the rest of Ukraine would come under the NATO umbrella. Do you think that's something that Putin would even consider as part of a peace settlement?
Oh, I really don't know. I certainly doubt that he's willing to accept anything that would include even rump, what's left of Ukraine joining the NATO alliance.
It's the little things. What's left of Ukraine? Like they've only got what's left of Ukraine is only marginally less than what they had in February. All things considered, considering much of the Donbass was gone and Crimea, annexed as well. The old what's left of Ukraine. So straight away, from just these little things, little words, where this guy is sitting.
I hope that Trump would not entertain that. That's what this has been largely about, of course, along with
NATO.
The contest over who controls what territory inside the country is preventing exactly that conclusion. I think it's a real dilemma because the Ukrainians, it's not just that Trump has won an election on repudiating Biden's policy and seeking peace here. It's quite frankly that the Ukrainians are just in no position whatsoever to reverse Russia's gains on the ground. Even the Biden administration admits that now. The Post, the Times, and the Journal all quote military experts saying that that truly is the case. So, in other words, Kiev and
no, he calls it Kiev. He goes on to call Zaporozhye. He calls Kharkiv though, so a bit of a mess. But that tells you where he's coming from. I think he's broadly a Russian simp, from what I can gather, and it's all NATO's fault. And we'll go on to talk a bit later about how the sort of Warsaw Pact countries, it wasn't that NATO encroached on them, it's that they went straight to NATO. And that is the key foundational problem to people who adhere to NATO expansionism, is that they've got this idea that NATO goes around the world saying, can you join? Can you join? NATO said no to Ukraine. NATO have been saying no to more people than they say yes to, because it would cause too many problems. This idea that they are massively encroaching in their desire to create a NATO empire is absolute nonsense. They are a defensive alliance, and if people come to them and it works and it fits for them to be part of NATO, then they will accept them into NATO. But they didn't go to Poland. Poland came to them. And that's really important to know. But yeah, just everything this guy appears to say is dodgy as sin.
DC are in a position of weakness.
Go back a bit though.
In the Journal, all quote military experts saying that that truly is the case. So
that's just reminded me. So he's talking about how they can't take that territory back militarily, but that's arguably precisely because the Biden administration didn't go hard enough in supporting of Ukraine. So that's something he conveniently doesn't talk about, because obviously he's against the whole war, full stop. So, just problem.
In other words, Kiev and DC are in a position of weakness, and all Trump really...
They are not in a position of weakness. Okay, Kiev is, need boots on the ground, lost a lot of people, but actually militarily, they're in a far better position now than they ever were, in terms of what capabilities they have and what capacity they have, and their industrial capacity now getting going. A far better position now than they were in February 2022. So I don't know what he's talking about. Weakness, Russia are on the precipice of an economic collapse. Russia have had massive attrition. This is now the moment where Russia is weak and Western allies need to go hard in supporting Ukraine. He's got it precisely wrong. Yes, Ukraine are weak in terms of personnel. Outside of that, this is a really important moment to continue and increase support, to continue supporting and increase that support for Ukraine.
He has to threaten is more weapons sales and increase weapons shipments. But Biden already tried that. That didn't make the difference. And
he didn't try that. He tried some of that. He said, here are some weapons, but you can't properly use them. Here's this, but I don't want that to happen. Now, I've just been speaking to James, actually, from Ryan, Ukraine. So he was talking to me about why ATACMS weren't allowed, and it's all to do with the guidance mechanisms on board. That's the key. All of these other excuses, it was actually some key software and locational technology. But now that has been allowed, I wonder whether you'll see, well, I don't know now, but you would have possibly seen other things. But nonetheless, it's not that more weapons is the only option. They can give more weapons and release restrictions on those weapons, really support the industrial military industrial complex in Ukraine to be able to produce all the things that the West is slightly reluctant to give Ukraine. There are lots of things that can be done. There's lots more intelligence that can be shared with Ukraine. So I contest them on virtually every point.
So I think what's going to happen is the Russians are going to keep probably all 4 of those eastern and southern provinces there. Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, and
Zaporozhye.
hopefully will
Notice
not
that.
demand Kharkiv or Odessa. We can, stop it there. And the Trump administration is going to have to get their messaging straight that this truly is a betrayal, and they admit it, but that it's Biden's betrayal. Biden made this country and these people promises he could not possibly keep. We're going to help you force the Russians all the way out and all of these things. And all they've done is gotten a bunch of people killed, and then they lost anyway. And it's a real tragedy, but it's not Trump's.
Listen to his word. And they lost anyway. Like, they've lost. Right, this is where I get angry, because this guy is an absolute douchebag, right, of the highest order. Right. In February 2020 or March 2022, the Russians were on the doorstep of Kyiv. They were in Bucha, Irpin. They were all over the Ukrainians in the center of Ukraine. They were surrounding Kharkiv and Sumy. The amount of land that they had there compared to what they have now, this guy is now said they have lost now. Like, what was he saying back in February? They were really lost then, but now they're only half lost now that they've regained much of that territory. And meanwhile, they've attrited the Russian armed forces to the point where they're using cyclists to go across the field to show a single BMP where to go. They're using golf carts, and they're using motorcycles, and they're using submarine rockets stapled on top of an MTLB chassis. Like, what is he talking about? They have lost. Just abject nonsense.
Fault. Trump has to be able to have the political capital in this country to say that, look, it is ugly. But you know what, Piers? He actually, and I don't know how he did this, he got Zalmay Khalilzad, the card-carrying neoconservative Straussian, to sign a deal with the Taliban to get us out of there. And yes, Biden absolutely botched the withdrawal. I could go on for an hour about that.
Please don't.
But Trump was willing to say, you know what? We lost. We're not keeping the Taliban out, and we're going to stop trying now. And Biden, it was really the best thing Biden ever did in his life was agree with that, even though he botched the process of the withdrawal. And so it's the same kind of thing here. It is a real tragedy what the Biden administration has gotten the country of Ukraine into here.
So, I mean, this guy is an absolute anti-Biden chap, which is fine, right? There's lots to criticize Biden's handling of the war in Ukraine over. But if you're coming to this with like, right, I really hate Biden, I really hate the liberals, I'm a conservative libertarian, and I hate war, and I think NATO encroachment and expansionism a la John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs, like if that's my worldview, then I'm going to write a 775-page book on that. That is just going to be full of that kind of incredibly problematic viewpoint. I mean, goodness me. Yes, so just to let you know about the ATACMS as a bit of a digression. So James says, right, what does he say? M code. It's the military's proprietary encrypted GPS. This is what has been holding up the long-range missiles, Taurus, ATACMS, etc. They use this for navigation, and it is resistant to most electronic warfare. And the United States doesn't want to let Ukraine have it. All the other BS reasons are just BS. Here's my recent post on the subject. Quote, I finally understand Western countries' reluctance to provide the long-range missiles they've refused until recently. I still don't think it was justified now that I've studied the exact technical reasons, but more importantly, it's possible that with the approval of these long-range systems, and as Schultz says, who will program them, it's possible that Ukraine may gain access to the US and NATO's encrypted GPS system, M-code. This is GPS that basically cannot be spoofed, to give a simple explanation. This would make Ukraine's drones vastly superior on the battlefield if it were allowed to use the M-code system. This is something Ukraine should have been given 2 years ago so that we could develop and integrate it into drone systems. I would argue it's even more important than the missiles themselves. Right, so it's stuff like that, that needs to be taken into account. Anyway, back to the video.
Cenk,
we're not going to go to Cenk. Actually, as much as I'd like to play the whole video, there is an awful lot to like about this panel discussion, an awful lot to get insanely angry about. We're going to go back to Scott Horton because I like to just get angry about people who annoy me.
Would say dampen the mood.
Yeah, I understand that. Scott, a lot of people have come on this show since this war started, and they've made the argument, which I know that you subscribe to, which is effectively the West and Ukraine goaded Russia into doing this.
I love this. Piers says, a lot of people have come on the programme and spouted Russian propaganda because I like to platform people that spout Russian propaganda. And what you'll notice Scott Horton does is he says, as soon as you say, I've got a friend that I argue with Facebook on this, he says exactly the same thing. As soon as I make these criticisms, you just say it's Russian propaganda. Yeah, because you've sunk it. You have drunk that Kool-Aid. And Scott Horton's a funny one. I think he's married to someone of Ukrainian descent as well. But yeah, he is right in there as far as regurgitating the real sort of pro-Russian propaganda.
It's by continually pushing for NATO membership, for NATO encroachment and so on, as the Russians saw it. There's not
as the Russians saw it.
This could have been resolved diplomatically. That actually, yeah, you can take that argument. You can see there's merit to that argument, certainly to a degree, but it doesn't justify launching a full invasion of your neighbouring country.
This is a really good point, and I made this point in my opening essay or article on this at the beginning of the war that was on Only Sky. Unfortunately, the site's been taken down, but my own website that's going to be up somewhat soon will have all of my articles, 5,000 of them over the years, up. Now, I made a case that, you've got like NATO and this and that and a very complex set of interacting variables going on here. But even if you grant this position that it was NATO's fault, even if you grant that, which is kind of what Piers is saying here. Yeah, okay, make that argument, fair enough. I can agree with that, disagree with that. But let's grant that. It doesn't justify Russia invading another country. And that's the point. And that's the point that Scott would get, I presume. I've not read his book, but I presume it's entirely wrong, which is you can think that there was all this goading, but when it's like, I'm teasing this thug, we're teasing this thug, and then he comes up and he murders one of the people. Well, not even that's teasing him. Like, we're teasing him. I'm teasing a thug on behalf of someone else, like, bleh, and then the thug gets so angry that he kills that other person. You're like, yeah, okay, I can understand like the goading part, but it still doesn't justify him going and killing someone else. We can understand a causal effect there, but so that NATO or the US were doing things on the sidelines does not justify Russia invading a country, committing all sorts of war crimes and killing civilians left, right and centre. It just doesn't. It doesn't. So whatever case you've got, Scott Horton, it does not justify what Russia did. And that's what we're dealing with.
Would you accept that the invasion itself didn't actually have to happen?
Yes, I have a whole section in my book about all of Putin's different options that he could have taken. The book is not called Justified, why Russia had to do what they had to do. It's called Provoked, how Washington started the new Cold War with Russia and the catastrophe in Ukraine.
But provoked how Washington started. Provoked how Washington started. So, yeah, I give all these options, but I blame Washington. I give all the... Yeah, he could have done other things, but Washington still made him do that. So he's saying like, he had these options. He's basically agreeing with the principle. He had these options, Putin, but he decided to do this one, but then just completely goes against that and still blames the provoker. It's just giving Putin a free pass. And I find it morally repugnant. So Scott Horton, you are morally repugnant.
Because the book is 700 pages.
What do you do?
All of this going back to the end of the
700
last
pages
Cold War.
Of
And,
BS? I don't know.
With all due respect to the guy that shot bin Laden in the head, thank you. And with all due respect to this young woman whose poor country is being bombed to death and their opinions here, it's just not the case that what we have is a simple case of a Hitlerian, Putin-led Russia running roughshod and rampage, and the only thing to stop them is when tough, good guys like us stand up to a bully like him. For example, in a war that they both cited numerous times here today, the Georgia war was begun by the American sock puppet, Saakashvili. He launched that war and killed Russian peacekeepers in his initial assault. And they lied about that, led by John McCain during the campaign at the time in 2008. But even the New York Times later admitted that, yeah, it was true, that was how that war started. And it was and part of his motivation to do that was that Bush, a few months before, had given him sort of a pseudo membership action plan for joining NATO. But you can't join NATO if you don't have settled borders. And Georgia had these two breakaway provinces under Russian protection. And so he was trying to reincorporate them so he would have a settled border so he could join America's military alliance, which completely blew up in his face and got a bunch of people killed. But that's just not the same thing as Putin wakes up every day scheming on how he can conquer Poland, and only America's threat of ultimate H-bomb annihilation is holding him at bay. It's just really not like that. It's much more complicated.
And I don't want to go down a rabbit hole. You can go and check the Wikipedia page for, there's a Wikipedia page for responsibility for the Russia-Georgian war, right? And I mean, the opening conclusions are, it was Russia what did it. So, yeah, not to say, always check your sources, and that includes Wikipedia references, etc., etc. All the caveats apply, and these things are complicated. But this guy is just, how can we make it that the imperialist US is responsible for everything that's bad in the world? Right, as a libertarian, these big governments that go around the world starting wars, I'm going to blame them. Although I'm not going to blame the other people that are involved in doing that, like the Russians. I'm just going to blame the Americans here. The Russians fighting these ghost people, the Americans fighting the ghost people of Russia. They're really, it's only the Americans that are at fault for everything. It's like, dude, give over.
Complicated than that. And, again, back to your original question, it's not to say that he's justified in what he's done, but it's like if you get in a bar fight and you're shoving a guy with a knife in his pocket and he stabs you, that doesn't justify you shoving him, doesn't justify him stabbing you, but also you were shoving a guy with a knife in his pocket, and don't pretend like he just woke up this morning looking to pick a fight with you. And one more thing here.
And to be fair, well, not to be fair, the problem here is that causality is a massively difficult thing to unpick. There are like J.L. Mackey's Inus conditions. For example, you got insufficient but necessary conditions that on their own, they don't contribute to something happening, but all things together do. So, for example, a great example of Inus conditions in causality is if you had a house fire, right? And you got this fire that started, and you got, okay, so you got someone left the gas on, you got the gas leaking, you got then someone coming in and turning the light switch on that makes a spark, and then the house catching fire. So, okay, like, does the light turning on cause a fire? No. Does the gas being left on cause a fire on its own? No. Does gas on its own cause a fire? No. Does the person's intentions or forgetfulness? And you got all of these things that have to be in place for the fire to start. So the problem here for someone like Scott Horton is to go, right, we've got this really complicated causal mixture, which he sorts of understands there. So he's talking about, okay, you doesn't justify the reaction, but you were there pushing a guy with a knife. and it's kind of victim blamey a little bit here, but it's also just to really simplify causality and still pick out one thing. So he says, "Oh, it's really complicated. You shouldn't be doing this," but Washington's to blame because provoked. I mean, the nature of the book it tells you all you need to know. So, how Washington started. In other words, that's like saying, so the fire situation, it's provoked. How turning on a light started the fire. Yeah, but, you know, if the gas wasn't leaking, just that would have been turning on a light. Provoked. How leaving the gas on started the fire. Yeah, but no, because that alone wouldn't have started the fire. It required turning. Do you know what I mean? So he's saying there's a complicated causal scenario here, and I'm just going to blame these people because that's my agenda. Right? That's what he's doing.
Great example, and then I'll leave it, is the status quo in Crimea held from 1991 all the way through 2014. What changed was that, and there was a controversy over it. It's an extremely important Russian naval base there at Sevastopol and the rest of this. It was in controversy since independence, but the status quo held until the Barack Obama government overthrew the government of Ukraine for the second time.
And this is where you just want to pick him up by the earlobes and then nut him. I'm not a violent man. Just, we're going down the coup. We're going down the Barack Obama coup, the US-led coup of Maidan protests and Crimea. Somehow, I guess he's going to say is rightfully Russian, or this was not a problem until Barack Obama.
In 10 years, and then the new regime
I love it.
immediately threatened to repeal and abolish the Kharkiv Pact, the agreement by which Russia was allowed to stay at Sevastopol. And it was only then that they seized the Crimean Peninsula. So it's not to say that, oh, it was perfectly justified for them to do so, but it is to say that it was Barack Obama and Joe Biden who picked that fight, and then it was Putin who finished it. And then this is a big...
The way he frames this is so annoying, because it's exactly what we've just been talking about. Like, it's not blaming Putin. They started this, Putin just finished it. But Putin freaking invaded and annexed another area of the country that wasn't his. Like, excuse him, he just finished it. But really, the blame is Barack Obama and Joe Biden. Mate, that is so problematic.
Part of the reason why the war in the East broke out immediately was because when the dissenters seized buildings in the East, and including with some Russian help, just like the Westerners helped the Maidan, they declared war against them. They overreacted.
The Westerners helped the Maidan. I mean, this is Russian propaganda.
At John Brennan's behest, we know this, it was reported in Forbes. John Brennan went there on April 12th. They launched the war on the 14th. And the reason
John Brennan went there on the 12th and they launched it on the 14th. So therefore, John Brennan caused a war 2 days later. What are you talking about?
They did that was because the coup had already blown up in their base in the loss of Crimea. Right. So they weren't about to tolerate this kind of dissent in the East. It's not Russian propaganda. I'm a Texan. I don't even read Russian or know what the Russians say about this stuff.
Oh,
this is the history of the world.
I speak Russian. That's my...
That's
yes.
fine. Listen,
can I please interject with that?
Well, let me just say right here. Anytime anyone contradicts the party line on this, that's all anyone ever says is that this is Russian propaganda. But that's just a bunch of crap. Because it is.
Why is it not Russian propaganda? Okay, you are saying exactly the same as Russian propaganda. Now, there may be a convergent evolution of those conclusions, right? That you might have come to those conclusions separately from being fed it by the Russians, but it's out there in the information space. The Russians have fed that into the information spaces in a way that people pick up on it and then go for it and take it on. And if it fits with your agenda, because the Putin agenda is your agenda, which is anti-democrat, anti-US establishment, anti-NATO, anti-US hegemony. And in his case, he would go down the libertarian route. But in the Russian case, it's going down the Russian hate America route. But you get to the same place, right? And so To say it's not Russian propaganda, I think is doesn't work, because it is Russian propaganda. It's what they say, and you are saying it. You might not realize it, but it's out there precisely because of what they've been doing for the last 20 years.
You repeated it. You repeated it in
and
English.
I'm just speaking the truth.
Are you getting money or not?
Are you? Are you getting money or not? I'm just speaking the truth. Anyone can say that. It's meaningless twaddle.
I'm just wondering,
break, lady.
At least they
Give me a break, lady. You deserve a punch in the face, my friend.
pay
See,
you.
that really is all you have, because you can't contradict any of my facts, so you have to come up with this nonsense.
I can contradict everything you said. I participated in Maidan.
No one in America cares about Russia at all, lady. Nobody in America cares about Russia. Back in the days of communism, there were communists that did.
Can I please have a word? This person.
So, what's just thinking about this, because this interaction is interesting. I'm getting angry and motivated because I've been invested in this for so long. Emotionally as well as politically. But his reaction there is very emotive, and the way he did that is non-academic. Right, so if you're an academic writing about the politics and history of this situation, you wouldn't be, come on, lady, reacting like that. That is the sort of thing I would do, but I'm not coming at this from an academic point of view. And I just think that hides, it belies exactly what this is to him, which is a close to the bone ideological thing, as opposed to so if you're a historian that was looking at this in 50 years time, like if you're looking at the causality of, say, the Second World War, and you'd have a disagreement with someone else looking at the causality of the Second World War, you wouldn't be going, hang on a second, lady, blah blah blah. You'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, but no, that's wrong. And I might get a little heated because we're arguing, but essentially you wouldn't be talking in those terms. So that to me represents that this for him isn't a case of trying to sit down and write a book because you want to understand the situation. This is a case of sitting down and writing a book so that you can make a case that big government US is wrong. Right? You sit down and write a book for an agenda. Like I'm not interested in discovering the truth through my writing and research. I have my conclusion, and I am we can do that. I've written books where I've already got my conclusion and I'm writing that out. But in this way, when it's a political ideology that you are arguing for, I think it then becomes really part of your identity. You could argue this in terms of when I argue about religion and atheism and whatnot, and I write books, but actually it gets rather abstract and it can get very heated. But actually, I think there's a lot of abstract philosophizing. This is politics just seems to be so much part of people's psyche that I think this is basically his book. I imagine is something of political propaganda.
Person spoke quite a bit. We had given him a rooper to repeat Russian talking points and lies, blatant lies. So
okay. Well, Scott, let Anna just respond to what you were saying, Scott. I'm interested to hear her response.
A lot of bullshit was said, so it's kind of difficult to counter everything. Basically, it was not a coup. It was a revolution that millions of people participated in. The reason we participated, me included, I was 19 back in the day.
This is really important because what people do, people like Scott Horton, will say that they only see, and I've said this many, many times, they only see Ukraine as a tool of either the West or of Russia, and they forget the agency of the people involved themselves. What's really important about this interaction, which in my opinion should just essentially debunk Scott Horton's case completely, is that you've got someone who lived it and experienced it and was there at Maidan. Myself personally, I've spoken to people at Maidan. I've spent a lot of time with Zhenya, who acted as a doctor in Maidan, treating the people who were injured and who died at that protest, and knows the people. Like, if you want to see one of the greatest ever documentaries I've ever seen, go and see Winter on Fire, which is on Netflix, but is also for free on YouTube now. I think Netflix have put it on YouTube. It's not like it's an official one. It is an incredible documentary. that will give you. So someone like Scott Horton needs to watch that. I bet he hasn't, because that will let him know why people were really protesting. So this idea that the whole of Maidan was just a US McCain, Brennan, Newland conspiracy doesn't explain why hundreds of thousands of people were protesting, actually across millions across Ukraine. But all those people, predominantly young people at the beginning, protesting behind barricades for that length of time. You wouldn't be doing that and risking your life because Victoria Nuland, right? It's just utter BS. And she's saying, look, I was a 19-year-old at the time, and I'm telling you why I was there. You can't tell me why I was there. You can't tell me that I was somehow a manipulated entity from these kind of interstate actors. I was there because of who Yanukovych was, who I understood him to be, because he had reneged on his promise to the electorate. I was a member of the electorate. We didn't like that, so we went out and protest. Frickin' deal with that, Horton.
It was because we had severe problems with corruption and a tyrannical puppet of Russia, Yanukovych, who refused to make a treaty with the European Union, which is what most of the people in Ukraine wanted, 60-something%, and especially younger people wanted to move away from Russian control, from Russians owning every single business industry in my country, and to have some sort of like laws and order, and also have some sort of democracy and liberty that is what something people have in the West, and that's something that we did not have. So that was about, a revolution was about that, about students going and protesting and getting beaten up, and Yanukovych then going to Russia to essentially ask Putin, his buddy, how can he stop the protesters, which he then made dictator laws that prohibited people to effectively protest at all in this country. So we didn't appreciate that, and we went. Literally millions of people participated in Maidan. That is not a coup. That is not something you buy for Obama or Nuland cookies. I'm sorry to say, never received a single cookie yet. It's been a long time. And yeah, all of that, when going to Georgia is a whole other thing, but that's just what Russia does. It creates unrest. It supports militias in the countries, and then it basically floods them with weapons, and it also applies its own soldiers to annex territory by the guise of protecting Russian speakers or any.
This is very, very important. So when you have people like Scott Horton that are hell-bent on blaming the US or blaming the West or blaming NATO for X, Y, and Z, what they do is they let Russia off the hook, and they don't understand that even if you grant NATO was doing some kind of activity or the US was doing something, it's not in a vacuum. So when the US is getting involved in Ukraine, if and when it gets involved prior to 2022, it's doing that because Russia's involved. So Russia, I mean, you understand what's going on in the war with all the collaborators around Ukraine, because Russia has mixed itself in. I mean, you think of the history of Ukraine over the last 200 years, right? It is intrinsically linked to Russia or the Soviet Union or whatever. And there would be so much influence coming from Russia that is let off the hook by people like Scott Horton. So he'll say, oh, Victoria Nuland, or he'll say, oh, Jim Brennan. How many Russians has he mentioned that have been infiltrating or doing or influencing? What does he say about Sergei Lavrov and his influence? What does he say about? Like for the number of Western people, McCain, involved in Ukraine in the 2010s, you can multiply that by 20. And you'd be not even close to the amount of Russians involved. And then you've got little green men. Like the Americans didn't send in little green men. So, you know, like you've got puppet leaders like Yanukovych. Just, it's this one-tracked focus on one side of the causal coin, right? At the exclusion of the other, and it lets the other side off scot-free. And, by the way, I don't think those people are as causally as important as Scott Horton says. They are reacting to the threat that Russia is posing to the sovereign democratic nation of Ukraine. And lo and behold, they were right to react to that, because Putin had his aim set on Ukraine then, and as he did you can see in his essay in 2020, and as you can see, he does still.
Of that. Scott is a master, I believe Scott is the name, right? Here, but I am a Russian speaker from Eastern Ukraine. It's about as east as it gets in Kharkiv, and I didn't require their protection. I was never prosecuted. What they did is that they attacked us under the guise of protecting Russian speakers that was never prosecuted in this country, because half of us literally are Russian speakers. We have been Russified back in the day by Russian Empire. So yeah, this war is not about you. I'm sad to say some things are not about America. This war is about our very long time, centuries long oppressor trying to thrust us back under their control. And we didn't want that. People in Georgia don't want that. If you can see it by now, currently, by the revolution and the protests going on in the country, exactly for the same reason, because their corrupt Russian puppet government refused the people's will to be part of Europe. So it was never about NATO, because we never discussed joining NATO until Russian invasion. It was never even a conversation in Ukraine about joining NATO. So thanks for the lies, obviously. Also, yeah, they do have borders with NATO right now, and they had them before. Now it's even bigger. It doubled because Finland, in fear of Russia, joined NATO. That's why people join NATO, because they want protection from Russian aggression.
Okay. Thank you, Anna. Rob, you've been waiting.
Absolutely brilliant response there. Now, your man Rob then joins in, and he gives I'm learning lots from both of you, but then he gives a whole kind of like American empire type thing, and it's pretty problematic. I'm not going to listen to that due to having already spent 40 minutes, and we haven't even got to the main part here, which is where Wesley Clark comes in, and he's absolutely fantastic. So let's listen to him.
A quick break to speak to the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, General Wesley Clark. General, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Oh, happy to be here, Piers. I'm listening to this panel. Look, there's a lot of misinformation.
Yes.
I was in Ukraine on the 31st of March. I went through Maidan. I talked to the people. I looked at the lamppost where Putin's henchmen had killed a bunch of Ukrainians. There were a bunch of bullets still embedded in the lamppost. I followed it very, very closely. I don't know exactly what you want to talk about. If I'd been on your panel, I would have probably disagreed with most of them. The people in Ukraine are fighting for democracy. NATO didn't push itself to the borders. It was drawn to the borders by the people in Eastern Europe who wanted freedom. They wanted freedom from Russian oppression. That's why NATO expanded in response to them, not because NATO wanted to expand. It's because in order to stabilize, you had to be able to provide investment, and to get investment, people needed security, and they were living in fear of Russia coming back. Now, when did Putin decide to come back? As soon as he became president in 1999, at the speech he made in the inauguration of President Kuchma in Ukraine. Putin said, Ukraine and Russia, we're more than brothers, we're in each other's souls. Poland sent its national security advisor to see me after that, said, he's trying to restore the Soviet Union. He's coming after us. So this is a long-held ambition by Mr. Putin. And he's seen weakness in the West repeatedly. And that weakness has encouraged him to move. And it's going to continue until the West shows strength. And that strength means providing much more to Ukraine, bringing Ukraine into NATO, and saying to Mr. Putin very directly, look, stop. We're not interested in strategic arms discussions. We're not interested in investing in your economy. We're not interested in having nice conversations in Switzerland with you until you pull back, return the children, account for the inductees, bring to trial the war criminals that have been indicted in Ukrainian courts, and you owe us close to $1 trillion in destruction of our country. So, Piers,
He's absolutely right, and he's speaking on behalf of Ukraine. There, he's being a Ukrainian in that discussion, but he's absolutely right. Like, let's not entertain. We know who Putin is now. We've seen him in Grozny, in Chechnya, in Georgia twice, and presently in Georgia and in Romania. We've seen him in Ukraine since 2014. We've seen him in Ukraine since 2022. We know who this guy is. Be under no illusion. Don't listen to someone like Scott Horton that goes around trying to blame the US for everything. And believe you me, I've blamed the US for an awful lot in my time. And I think there are elements of US imperialism that need curtailing. I think Iraq was deeply problematic. And we got wrapped up as a UK in that as well. So, and that's not to say what took place in South America over the 20th century, right? So I'm not one of these like neocon warhawk, a fan of whatever the US does whenever, like not at all. But when it comes to Ukraine, I think it's very clear, and I think Wesley Clark is spot on here.
Very clear lines. This is 1937, 1938, and you would have heard the same kind of apologists for Hitler. You would have heard them saying the peace in Versailles was unfair, and the French, and there's corruption and so forth. There's corruption in every government. It's there in your government. It's there in the United States. It's there in Ukraine, but it's never the same as it is in Russia, where organized crime works as an arm of the government connected to the intelligence agencies to assure that Putin and his cronies get what they want. So I think it's a very difficult time. I don't know how the negotiations are going to turn out, but I would tell you this, that Mr. Trump's in a tough position, because if he gives Putin what he wants, he looks weak to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And if he looks to the rest of the world, China's going to move. We've got in the United States a window now to do something in the Middle East, and I think Netanyahu probably will ask Mr. Trump to do it and pose a choice for the Iranian regime: either knock off the hegemonial aspirations and shut down this arc of resistance, including the weapons to the Houthis, or face the consequences. With Iran, you have to go to the source. With Russia, you have to stand firm. We've had deterrence in place for 70 years. We have nuclear weapons. Putin doesn't want to use a nuclear weapon. He's afraid of nuclear weapons, but he's using them to threaten. So people like your bearded guy whose name I didn't get, these are people who are repeating Russian talking points.
And I love this. I love the fact that you've got your expert here, and he goes on to talk about how he was one of these NATO officials involved in these conversations. But he's like, yeah, it's just Russian talking points.
It's exactly what the woman from Ukraine said. Now, I will tell you that people in Ukraine are suffering, and they would love an end to this conflict. They didn't choose it. It was forced on them.
Yes.
But
that is about seeing the Ukrainians having agency. That is about understanding that they are a political football between the West and Russia, potentially, arguably. And if you think they are, and if you think the US are responsible, or if you think Russia is responsible, yeah, okay, whatever. Should we not just ask the Ukrainians what they want? Should they not? That's all we need to know, really. Which is, what do you guys want? What are your feelings about this? Who do you guys want to align with? You should have the right to choose that.
The only way it's going to be successfully resolved is by strong U.S. leadership. And Mr. Trump is in a position where no matter what he said about ending the war in 24 hours, he's in a position where he simply cannot and will not concede everything that Putin wants. He won't do it. If he does, you won't make America great again. You'll invite war elsewhere in the world. So I see you brought in the rest of the panel here.
Yeah.
I'll stop.
Well, no, you know what, General? I've interviewed you many times. I've seen you interview many times. I've never seen you quite this angry. It feels to me like you're angry about where things have got to.
Well, Piers, I'm angry about hearing the misinformation from some members of your. Okay. Now,
Can I respond, please?
And I love that. It's like, I'm angry by hearing misinformation by some members of your panel. Mainly that guy. Yeah.
Can I explain something before you talk, please, sir? I was at the beginning of NATO enlargement. I was there at the beginning. I talked to foreign leaders. I set up the program as a staff officer in the Pentagon. I was the NATO commander who went to Bulgaria and Romania and Estonia and Latvia. And they told me, we've got to be in NATO. They didn't say, hey, if you want us, okay, I bet you blah, 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 blah. We said, we don't want you. It's too much of a problem. They said, please, please help us.
This is so important. Like, here is, I was there. I was doing the discussions. We didn't go there to try and get them into NATO. In fact, we thought it was too problematic. They were too frontline. But they really wanted it because they knew, and do you know what? They were freaking right. This was their route to security. How do we know they were right? Because they haven't been invaded by Russia. But do you know who has been invaded by Russia? The one country that didn't get NATO accession.
And so that's exactly what happened. That's how we got there. In 2014, when Putin went into Crimea, the Ukrainians could have stopped it, but they asked the United States, what should we do? And the United States told them, give up Crimea. Why? Because we wanted Putin's cooperation in the Middle East and with Iran to stop Iran's nuclear program. When Putin went further in Donbass, we provided information, but we provided no lethal assistance to Ukraine. For all these years, the United States administration was timid in dealing with Putin. It's like one member of the administration said recently, of the Biden administration said, oh, we never expected nuclear weapons. I mean, ooh. Nuclear weapons have been the foundation for Western security since the end of the Second World War. We've had near confrontations with the Soviets. And because American presidents didn't back down, we didn't have war. Now, Mr. Trump has put himself in an extremely difficult position. But all of our talk about Ukraine and telling Ukraine in advance, you're going to have to give up your territory. And by the way, you're not going to be a member of NATO. Let's not do any of this right now. Let's put the forces, let's get the forces in Ukraine the weapons and support they need so that the people who have already been mobilized can have these weapons and provide the reserves that are necessary in Ukraine. Let's leave an open-ended commitment for Mr. Trump. Let's tell the Ukrainians, strike to your heart's content in Russia. You get no sanctuary, Mr. Putin. You started this, you pay the price. And then let's go into the talk with understanding what we want. We want all of Ukraine's land back.
Yes.
We want reparations. We want the children returned. We want the missing people accounted for.
Yes.
And we want the war criminals put on trial.
Yes.
And then we can talk about sanctions relief. No sanctions relief until the conditions are satisfied.
This guy has it, right? We do not lift sanctions. I'm so worried that Trump's going to come in and lift sanctions first. No, you do not lift sanctions until the very end. They need to be economically bleeding so that they understand what they've done wrong and so they are not inclined to resurge.
And, it's very hard for democracies to be able to stand up to a man like Putin. He doesn't have to worry about re-election. But we need the leadership in the West. I've seen it in some countries. Macron sometimes comes off very strong. Britain has come off very strong in this. And right now, the Biden administration is trying to surge support into Ukraine. And I think President Trump, when he comes in, is going to realize that whatever his relationship is with Mr. Putin and however many times he's called him, he's not going to easily give in and sacrifice Ukraine. He can't afford to. And Putin's already threatened him.
Piers.
Putin's already told him that he's worried about his safety. That's like Tony Soprano saying to you, I'm really worried about the way you're walking across the street. So I'm not angry, Piers, except that there's a lot of misinformation out
I hear
there.
you.
Can I get in here and respond now, Piers, please?
Thank you.
Okay.
So he goes to Cenk Uygur before he comes back to Scott Horton. But he's angry, and I get why he's angry. By the way, I forgot one thing that Rob, the other guy on the panel, said. He's like, I don't like Putin, but I don't like Zelensky either. It's like, why would you not like Zelensky, who's just done an incredible job for his country? Just, yeah, it always gets me when that's the case. We're going to miss out the bit where Cenk Uygur and Wesley Clark are talking about, how long can the war go on? And, there's a really interesting discussion around that, for sure. But we're going to go back to Scott Horton and get his opinion. I think he comes in here.
You come after Ukraine, I promise you, you're going to lose. You're going to lose.
So this was just to let you know what he was talking about there. He was actually saying Biden wasn't strong enough. He didn't say you come after Ukraine, you're going to lose. Like that kind of really bellicose but strong rhetoric, the sort of Trumpian rhetoric, which is, bombastic, but actually that's what's kind of needed.
But he didn't say that, and he's never said that.
No, he hasn't.
That's the policy has to start.
Okay. General, thank you very much. Let me bring Scott Horton in to respond to that, because you're being compared to the people back in the late 30s who just didn't see the danger of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis.
It's completely preposterous, and it's the refuge of scoundrels who have run out of arguments. I think anyone could see that.
If you're thinking Wesley Clark is a scoundrel that's run out of arguments, he said, I've got Russian talking points, and here are my arguments, and he goes through all the arguments, and all he can say, he's a scoundrel who's run out of arguments. It's pathetic.
It's the same thing as this endless claim. I mean, isn't this just a talking point that anyone who disagrees is repeating Russian talking points?
But you are.
I don't sit around watching RT all day, memorizing what the Russian regime says.
Doesn't mean you're not
that.
regurgitating talking points.
Book that's 775,000 words. Most of it is American graybeards talking about how they know better than the thing that they're about to do, and then doing it anyway. And, one of the things that I talk about in there, although I couldn't find too much about General Clark's role in this, but when there was a debate, and I'd like to pose this in the form of a question to him, when there was a debate in the 1990s in the Bill Clinton administration about whether to do NATO expansion or whether to do the Partnership for Peace, was it not the Secretary of Defense, William Perry, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, John Shalikashvili, with the help of General Clark? Weren't they the ones who argued the Pentagon for peace? Let's do the Partnership for Peace instead of NATO expansion. And it was Richard Holbrooke and Talbot and Lake who outclassed the Pentagon in office politics and forced through NATO expansion instead. And the William Perry, John Shalikashvili, and I believe at the time, Wesley Clark argument was, we don't want to redraw the dividing line in Europe. Yes, it's true. A lot of these countries that used to be dominated by Soviet communists in the battle days, of course, want to join NATO. But we got to look at what's good for us. And what's most important for us is that we keep a decent relationship, a stable relationship with Russia. And one great way to do that.
No. What was good for NATO and those countries is those countries joining NATO. NATO is now much stronger and a much better defensive alliance precisely because it has Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, the Baltic nations, and now the Nordic nations. It's incredibly important. Not only do they have very good armies, but they're also becoming more and more solid democratic nations. Poland, the Nordic states are very, very sound. The Baltic states, likewise. Absolute nonsense. That whole argument you just made was just pure nonsense. No, we shouldn't not take them on because we want better relations with Russia. Putin only has one intention, and that is to be Peter the Great again. And NATO need to be able to be in a position to deter Russia from, my goodness, had Ukraine either had nuclear missiles or been part of NATO, Russia wouldn't have invaded. End of. Ukraine will be getting on doing its own little thing in the same way that Bulgaria is and Romania is. They aren't, because they are members of NATO, doesn't mean that NATO's involved in their democracies. They've been widely, look, Hungary. You've got a freaking pro-Russian dictator wannabe in charge of there, but it's still a NATO nation. So it just like
would be to, as they said they were going to do at the time, Piers, turn NATO into a political organization, sort of like the EU plus America. But then they would have, instead of an alliance, because there's no enemy anymore, now we would have the Partnership for Peace, a new security architecture, and Russia, the Russian Federation, and Ukraine would be members of it. And then that way, Ukraine's neutrality as a obviously extremely important country locked between European civilization and Russia there will not, the controversy will be settled with a de facto permanent neutrality there. And then what happened was the Hawks won the argument. And then as all of the graybeards said at the time, oh no, you see what we're doing? We're just redrawing the line. The policy has gone from containment to friends to neo-containment. This is before W. Bush ever even came to town.
Okay, well, let me put that point then to someone who, by the way, for the record, does not have a grey beard, General Clark. But would you like to respond to what you just heard?
It's actually, you're right. We had a multiplicity of interests with Russia at the time the Clinton administration came in. And the first interest was to control the nuclear weapons that were in Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and the loose nukes argument took priority. And we got legislation passed, the Nunn-Lugar Agreement amendment. Basically, we put billions of dollars into helping control the former Soviets' nuclear arsenal. And as part of that, we assured Ukraine that when they gave up their nuclear weapons, and Russia signed on to this, that their boundaries would be respected. You see, there in 1991, Ukraine had already voted in favor of independence. The people in Ukraine never wanted to be under Russian control. It's a separate culture. It's a different language. If you look up, and I don't know if you speak Russian, but apparently you don't, but I do. And I thought, well, I'll just go, brush up on my Russian and be able to speak Ukrainian. It's a different language. And it's a different culture. It's a different history. Ukraine's been independent in the past. And it was one of the first subjects of Russia's imperial ambitions going back to Catherine the Great. And the way that it operates is it's not a nice colonialism. It's an ugly colonialism in which Russia says, I'm in charge here. I want a part of your business. And they buy people and they influence. And I've met many Ukrainian leaders over the years, including some who've made billions of dollars off their associations with Russia. So when the United States looked at this in the early 1990s, we were hopeful that there would actually be democratic reform in Russia. But it didn't happen. And as Bill Clinton traveled abroad in 1993 and in 1994, and he looked at it himself and talked to these East European leaders who were emerging, they begged Clinton to give us the protection of NATO. And so
that's a really important point here from Wesley Clark, which is that, okay, that some of these early discussions that were taking place were under in the context of this belief that, what's the term for it? The Germans have got a term, it rhymes. There's a term, which is basically reform through assimilation. The kind of Angela Merkel approach, which is if we bring Russia in, if we bring Putin into the team, then Putin will reform, Russia will reform, democracy will just seep into Russia more effectively through osmosis. And then it got to a point where oh dear, that's not working, and Putin appears not to be like that. And so therefore you change your view of how things are and what the best option is. And that's kind of what Wesley Clark is intimating here.
Weekend that you're referring to when Al Gore made the speech that Richard Holbrooke wrote in Berlin. And yes, I checked with my bosses in the Pentagon. I said, no, of course we're not in charge of. We don't want NATO enlargement. We got enough problems. Don't bring any other issues. Partnership for Peace had already been established. Russia was a member of it, and I said, to my boss, I said, oh, they keep putting this thing in here about enlarging NATO. And I keep scratching it out and it keeps coming back in. And sure enough, Vice President Gore gave that speech, and he gave it at the direction of the President of the United States because President Clinton himself, in going through Eastern Europe, had looked and listened to the leadership there. He knew the history, he knew foreign relations, he knew foreign policy, and he determined that the best avenue for peace forward was to both provide security for Eastern Europe through opportunities for NATO membership if they wanted it, and work with Russia and give Russia a special relationship with NATO. So we formed the NATO-Russia Council. The NATO-Russia Council had all the members of NATO.
I love that he's just like spitting facts here. And, like this is actually what happened. And we were going for both those things, which is a partnership for peace with working really closely with Russia. I mean, I think billions of dollars went to Russia in terms of assisting them in the 90s, economically and politically, democratically. I mean, obviously, it didn't end up working. But and at the same time, allowing those countries that wanted to come into NATO to come into NATO. It was their agency. Stop seeing these countries as merely pawns of NATO and see NATO as essentially a pawn for those countries. NATO is being used by the Baltic nations and Poland and Hungary and Bulgaria as a way to ensure that they are militarily safe.
Listening to Russia and all of its concerns. In 1997, 1998, 1999. I was there sitting in that council when former Russian Foreign Minister Yevgeny Primakov gave us a lecture. Russia has no permanent friends. Russia has only permanent interests. And he's looking at me, and I know who he was. He's the guy who basically started the Palestinian terrorist organizations as a KGB agent. And he knew who I was, and we knew each other. And I knew what he was saying. He was saying that Russia didn't appreciate NATO, wouldn't cooperate with NATO, and was going to go its own way. He later ran for president, lost to Vladimir Putin. But the point is that the United States worked assiduously to try to bring stability to Eastern Europe, including working with Russia. And it was Russia that really didn't want this. From the beginning, we actually had hopes that Russia might join NATO. But from the beginning of Putin's time, he crushed democracy, crushed dissent, and step by step consolidated power using the mafia, the Russian mafia, and the intelligence agencies. And so we are in the position where we are today. I've always wished I could talk to Putin and say, look, it's not that we disrespect you. We like Russia. We love Russian music, culture, your history. There's so many great things that have come out of Russia. But you can't step on other people. You can't treat people that way. You can't invade other countries. We're not going to invade you. There's no threat here. I was with the Russian foreign minister when we were dealing with the Conventional Foreign Forces in Europe Treaty.
And sorry to interrupt again, but I don't want to diss Scott Horton, because I could sit and write a book and do loads of research, as I have done previously. I've written books where you research, and although it's more kind of philosophy, but if you're writing books on politics and history, you don't necessarily have to go there and experience that. You do your research and whatnot. So Scott Horton clearly hasn't been to Russia, doesn't speak Russian, says names in the Russian way, interestingly, Ukrainian names, most of them. But it's casting his opinion. And you've got Wesley Clark was like, dude, I was there. I literally spoke to the Russians that said, we don't want to be part of NATO. I spoke to the nations that said, we do want to be part of NATO. You weren't there, Scott Horton. You are layering over your agenda onto and looking at everything through your interpretive lens, which is fair enough. We all do that. But you have really gone to town in cherry picking data points to suit your agenda. I can tell you that ain't the way it was. And you know what? I was there. I experienced it. This is what they were like. This is what we were like, and these were our intentions at the time, and you don't understand this.
1998. And Minister Ivanov said, well, under this treaty, in a time of tension, NATO could put a division in Slovakia on the borders of Russia or Belarus. And I said, Mr. Minister, one NATO division on the borders of Belarus is a threat to Russia? Come on now. Ivanov laughed. He knew it wasn't a threat.
Yeah.
He knew it.
Yeah.
And so, you just, I'm not accusing anybody of reading and repeating what Russia's telling you to say. I'm saying there's a lot of misinformation out here.
Yeah.
But we are where we are. And the only way.
Well, can I ask just one short follow-up there, Piers?
Very, very quickly. We have to wrap, but very quickly, yeah.
Sure. Yeah, very briefly. I wonder, General Clark, if you're aware that your then boss, William Perry, he later told The Guardian that it was the greatest regret of his life that he did not do every single thing he could to stop Clinton from going down the path of NATO expansion.
Well, okay, I'll tell you what I'll do. Here's what I'll do, Scott. I'll just ask General Clark, and please be brief if you don't mind, General Clark, but was Clinton right or wrong, looking with hindsight?
Well, I think Clinton was right in hindsight because when you unravel what actually happened with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and I have the greatest respect for Dr. Perry, but the KGB, there's a book written on this called Putin's People, and you can read it. But basically, the KGB saw it collapsing in the late 1980s. They didn't trust Gorbachev. They moved the money to the West. When democracy started, most of the people in the political parties in Russia were former intelligence agents. They'd been schooled in how to campaign. They formed different political parties to make it appear as though there were different parties. But in reality, they were anxious to regain power. And so we never really followed through with the opportunity that the dissolution of the Soviet Union presented to us.
Right.
I mean, we could have sent democracy trainers into the Soviet Union. We didn't. We had the National Endowment for Democracy. It was just scratching the surface. We never really reached out to the Russian people. It's a different culture. They don't understand it. They're isolated. And just like the American people don't understand foreign policy, neither do the Russian people. A UN diplomat told me once, he said, you Americans are like the Russians. Most of your people don't even have passports. You live far from national borders. You don't have any appreciation for other nationalities. We could have extended a stronger hand in friendship. And I'm talking not Clinton, I'm talking about George H. Bush when it happened.
Yeah.
We just didn't do it. And we had a very brief window to make a great difference. We didn't. I think that the protection we provided through NATO membership for the countries of Eastern Europe and that we want to extend to Ukraine has been really important. If you look, I drove a couple of times from Eastern Poland into Ukraine. In Eastern Poland, the houses are painted, the fields are cultivated, everything looks good. As soon as you go across that border, the difference in prosperity is marked. And it's marked because Ukraine hasn't had the protection of the European Union and NATO. And that's why the people in 2014, 2013 in Maidan, they saw this. Ukraine and Poland were economically similar in the 1980s. But by 2014, Poland's GDP per capita was 2 or 3 times what it was in Ukraine, simply because Poland had the association with the West with its security provided by NATO. So we've got to get through what is more than a bump in a road. It's a critical period in international policy where we're going to decide whether the rule of law prevails or we're going to go back to the 19th century competition between empires and emperors and to hell with the people underneath.
General
and that's
Clark,
where we are right.
I've got to leave it there.
So, and I'll leave it there. But I love that because you've got Scott Horton trying to get this gotcha question, which is basically a quote mined, or at least a quote from someone important at the time to do with the Clinton administration, saying, here's this quote from The Guardian and blah, 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 blah. What do you think about that? And he's like, here's what I think about that. And then a lot of nuance, a lot of explanation, a lot of personal experience, and a proper contextualization of what they were talking about there, and that it's just honestly brilliant from from Wesley Clark. You know, someone that knows his onions. And then you've got Anastasia saying, you know, this is me as a Ukrainian, a Russian-speaking Ukrainian. I wasn't persecuted. So this whole nonsense, you know, Russian propaganda that the Russian speakers are persecuted. B, this is my experience of the Maidan protest. C, this is my experience of this war. And so on and so forth. And you put those things together and it just makes, I think, Scott Horton's case just, you know, paper thin. 775 pages of paper thin. And yeah, I don't have time for someone that appears to have a complete lack of understanding of actually what Ukrainians believe. Like, I've spoken to enough Ukrainians now. I've been to Ukraine. You know, not that, okay, whatever. But, you know, you speak to Ukrainians, you understand them a little bit, and you realise that they aren't just these tools of the West. You know, they're their own people who have their own ideas, their own sense of agency, and their own sense of a future. And their future is by and large seen with the EU and with Europe and with the West and hopefully with NATO and not with Russia. I mean, honestly, look at Russia now. Who would choose, like, EU or Russia? EU, thank you very much. Just Scott Horton. Honestly, mate, rewrite your book. I haven't read it, but I'm pretty sure you need to rewrite it. Anyway, that was a long one for me, but I think this topic is very interesting and gets me very engaged, and I have that emotive reaction that I guess you guys are used to by now. I get pretty angry. And we didn't listen to what you guys said and what this chap Rob said. But I think Wesley Clark there is a fantastic advocate for, you know, what the support Ukraine have been receiving, and for greater support still, and for NATO membership. I am a massive advocate of Ukraine joining NATO, and those who are arguing they shouldn't be able to, in Germany, in the US, in many other countries as well, who are being a little bit about that. No, they've got to be in NATO. I have no qualms about that. You've got to be in NATO. Second bite of the apple cannot happen. It cannot happen. So there you go. Anyway, that's enough from me. Let me know what you guys think. Please subscribe to the channel, like and share and do all those things. But I'll speak to you a little bit later with the actual geopolitics video. Toodle pips.